Hello, how are you all doing? I'm going to be doing a watercolor class with you today, and we are going to be painting this beautiful bee, or one of the other 5 bees that I have uploaded a photo of onto Discord. There will be a link in the description for all information and images that are on today's video. If you want to take a look at that, you can download them and reference them later on. I'm going to be teaching you how to do some sketching and also sharing some watercolor techniques with you. To start, I'm just going to go through a few things that you will need for this watercolor class. So obviously it is a watercolor class, and assuming that you guys are set up with your own watercolor paints, mine are Winsor and Newton half pans. They don't need to be professional grade, they don't have to be half pans, they can be liquid form straight from the tube. They can be any kind of watercolor. The easiest way for me to explain how to do things is to just go through it all, and if you have any questions, just pop them in the comments below and I will get back to you. If any of you are using watercolour straight out of the tube today versus me using my dried half pans, then I will explain to you the slight differences and how they need to be used. For those of you who weren't at the live class, this is now available for you to paint along with, pause, rewatch, rewind, and just paint and go through step by step. Here is just some basic 220 GSM paper. It's nothing fancy, it's not specific watercolour paper, it's just a little bit thicker so it will withstand a few layers of watercolour paint. As you can see with this one, there is a little bit of a curve where obviously the paper warped as I added more watercolour paint to it. However, there are a few ways that you can flatten out your pieces once you've finished them. So once the piece is completely dry and you can see a little bit of a warp to it, then all you have to do is flip it over onto the other side, use a damp sponge on the back of the paper and lay it between preferably 2 pieces of greaseproof paper or plastic, anything to stop it from sticking, and lay it underneath something very heavy. As it dries, it will dry completely flat. So you don't have to worry if your paper does warp a little bit today, there is a solution to flatten it later. As well as the paper I have here, I have a pencil for sketching out the bee and a selection of paintbrushes. These are just basic, not expensive. I didn't want to use specific watercolour brushes because I know that not everybody has these at home. I do have a few different types of brushes here. I've got a filbert, which is like a round, flat paintbrush in 3 different sizes. I'm not necessarily going to use all of them today, but I've just got them as a selection to show you. So I've got a 2, an 8, and a 12 in that. And I have the angled paintbrush as well, again in 2 different sizes. I've got a 3/8 and a half. So I've got different sized paintbrushes to work with here and a number 0 also, which can be used for the more detailed areas of the painting. You can, of course, use a single paintbrush for the whole thing if you want to. I found it easier to use tiny paintbrushes for the smaller details, and that's why I have that paintbrush with me today. I've got an eraser. I don't think I'll be using it. The idea is that we're going to be sketching so lightly that as you paint over it, you will no longer see any of the pencil marks and you won't need to erase it. I have myself a paint palette. I could have used the one that was with the paints itself, but I thought that I would do this here so I can show you how I pre-mix all my watercolors. Some tissue paper here for blotting, and the main thing you will need is water. I have 2 pots of water with me here today. I will probably clean out in this one and then refresh in this one. The worst thing that you can do is be a little bit lazy and not refresh your water, which is why I've got another one to hand as well, just in case, so I can refresh as I go. For those of you who have seen the Discord channel, there are a few worksheets that I have uploaded on there, which you can download. I'm going to be talking through them anyway, so you don't necessarily need them with you. Now that we have everything that we need, I'm going to first talk through some of the techniques of the watercolour paint. I will put markers in the description so you can skip through the sections or come back to them later in the video for reference. We're not going to start with the drawing or any of the sketching, we are just going to have a little bit of fun with watercolour, so I'm going to move that out of the way and I'm going to use 1 sheet of this paper just as a tester. Before I do any of the watercolour paintings, I always pre-mix my colours. So if you've read the wet on wet watercolour technique sheet that I've uploaded, there are a few ways that you can control watercolour paint. So the wet on wet technique isn't as simple as watching paint dry, not in this case. With wet on wet, you are mixing and adding multiple colours or layers of paint to the paper before it has had time to fully dry. This then allows the paint to blend and bleed into each other, creating this soft, fuzzy texture that you see here in this painting. Because the black and the yellow were wet at the same time, they've bled into each other and they've made a really soft, subtle blend between the two colours. Although this technique is not for the perfectionist, of which I am, there are a few ways that you can attempt to control it. So in this case, I've got 4 steps here, which I think will help in the long run with any watercolour painting. Ideally, you want to pre-mix all of your colours. By doing this, it will save time, but it will also mean that your paint has less time to dry on the paper. Now, when you're adding other colours or layering up, it allows them to blend and bleed in together a lot easier. You can watch the movement of the paint. I know it sounds really silly to watch paint, but if something's happening that you're unhappy with, if you see too much of the black bleed into the yellow or any other colour that you're using and you're not happy with it, that you can simply use a dry brush and lift it out. A couple of lifting out techniques. You can use a dry brush to lift out the paint, and you can use a paper towel to dab down on it as well. But make sure that when you're lifting out wet paint, it is a clean, dry brush every time. So if you've placed the paint down and you don't like the way that it is, you can lift it up, but you have to use a clean brush and dry it off on the paper towel before you lift again. We also have layering the paint to add depth. Once you're happy with the placement of your paint, you can always layer, go back, add more on top of it. For example, if you have the black in this area and it wasn't dark enough for you, then you can always layer more to add a bit of depth to your picture. And as you can see in this area, which is a little bit lighter, it's not that I've used a different paint. I simply lifted it out to create a highlight in that area. So if I wanted to create highlights, I simply remove some of the paint with a clean dry brush. It's easier with a dry brush because you're not adding more water to the paint, which will make it bleed even further. It won't remove all of the paint and you won't get back to the original paper that you started off with. However, if you make a mistake, work very quickly, use a wet paintbrush, a clean wet paintbrush, lift it off by dabbing the paintbrush, and then use the paper towel to lift that. But as we go through, you'll be able to see all of these things as I test them out on the paper for you anyway. So I'm going to just do a little bit of mixing up now. I'm going to mix some paint colours. For the sake of this experiment, I might as well mix up the colours that I'm going to be using anyway, so I will mix a yellow and a black to start off with. Working with dry watercolour paints, they are completely dry and they need to be activated with water. What I like to do is make a little puddle or a pool of water in the palette to give me an area in which the paint can sit. Then I'll take my wet paintbrush and activate the paint. Fill up my paintbrush with quite a lot of paint and then fill this little puddle. As we go through, you'll notice that if you wanted a more solid or opaque colour, you simply add more watercolour paint or go straight from the pan. If you want a lighter colour or a slightly translucent colour, then you would simply add more water. In some cases with paint, when you want to make the colour lighter, you would add white, but not in the case of watercolours. If you want to lighten them with watercolour paints, you just add more water. So there's my black, and we can now test this out in a minute to see how opaque it is. If I want it darker, I can add more from the pan, and if not, I can keep it as it is. So I'm just going to add another pool of water here, which is where I'll be putting my yellow. This is where it's really important to have 2 separate pots of water, because if I dipped into the black water, then my yellow would be less vibrant. For this painting, I'm going to use a mid-yellow here. Again, I'm activating my watercolours by adding water to the dry pan and then placing this in the little puddle of water that I've got. Once I'm happy with that, I can test it out on the paper. Again, this is just a test sheet for me to run through some of the techniques from the worksheet that I showed you earlier on. And if you do want to have a look at it in more detail, you can have a look in the description below to a link to the Discord where everything will be for you. I'm just going to clean off my paintbrushes now, and I'm going to keep this paper towel in my hand ready. Clean water, so we're ready to go with the yellow first. We're always going to start with the lighter colour because I feel that the lighter colour I need more movement from versus the darker colour. So I'm just going to do a couple of lines to show you what I mean. So let's test this here and how dark this yellow is. That's all right. I'm happy with that yellow. There's enough pigment in that for me, so we'll keep it as it is for now. So whilst this is completely wet on the paper, I'm going to dip into the black and I'm going to place it next to it. I'm not going to go right up to it just yet. I will work my way up. I'm not 100% sure on whether or not this is going to be dark enough, so I will probably add more pigment to this straight from the pan as I go. These two paints are still soaking wet on the page, and I mean really, really wet. So what I'm going to do now is creep this black up to the yellow, and you will see that it starts to bleed when the colours touch. And this is where you can watch the paint. So with this, I can see that the paint is moving, and I'm fine with that at the moment. But as the paint is creeping in and I'm not happy with some parts of where the black is going, I have a dry paintbrush in my hand and I can simply lift it out, making sure that it's dry in between when I lift up different areas. Where these areas have blended in together, I'm happy with that. If you want to, you can add straight from the palette to make it slightly darker, so I can go in straight to the black from the pan whilst the paint is still wet and add more depth to that black. Now, because these paints are still wet, as soon as I add this black from the pan, it is going to bleed and blend in with the paint that's already on the paper. Again, I can watch the bleed out, cleaning off my paintbrush in between, and you can go back in with the yellow again. I'm probably going to do that straight from the pan to give it a little bit more opacity on the yellow that I've got on the paper. It's up to you how much you want to let these colours spread into each other. Obviously, if you're not happy with it, you can continue to lift out, but make sure you dry your brush between every lift out. This is the only way that you can control the flow of the watercolour. And this is the effect that you will get to lift out and create a highlight. Again, as you can see, the colour of the paper is never going to go back to what it was previously. It will always be just a faint version of the colour that's on top of it. So I've lifted over the black and it's left a grey colour. If I clean my paintbrush and dry it up, I can lift over the yellow side. There will be a slightly yellow tint left on the paper. Hopefully you have understood the blending and the lifting of colours. Obviously, if you did a mistake and you had paint that was still wet, let's do this now. So I've accidentally done a blob of black paint and I didn't want it to be there. I've got a wet paintbrush and I simply wet it on the page and dab it off. You have to be very, very quick because if there's a slight chance that the paint has had a little bit of drying time, it creates a hard edge that you can't remove. As watercolour paint dries, it leaves a really, really cool effect on the paper. So as you can see here, the inside of this splat was wet for longer. And as the outside dried, I lifted the middle and it created two different tones. Another way that you can use paint is layering up. So let's mix some other colours. Let's mix a bluey green. I'm a sucker for a turquoise colour. Blue green sort of colour. I love them. So I'm going to mix one of those. I do have a bluey green colour somewhere, but I'm just going to mix one. So here's another pool of water that I am going to mix my bluey greens in with. I don't know which one I'm going to use, so I'm just going to mix them up today. I've just gone in and done what I said not to do. I have put the dirty paintbrush in what is supposed to be the clean water. It's fine. We can clean that out in a minute and start again with a fresh water when we need to. Another thing you need to consider when mixing your paints is to try and mix enough of them, especially if you are mixing up the paints like I am here today, mixing some blues and greens in together. I want to make sure that I have enough paint in my palette to use for the entire painting. If not, I want to feel confident enough to be able to remix that colour. I'm going to be layering up, so again, I want to make sure that my paintbrush is fully loaded with paint. It's really, really wet and full of paint so that you can layer up when you place the brush down on the paper. Sometimes it might not be as dark as you want. As you can see here, where I started and finished and lifted the paintbrush off of the paper, in between there is a lighter area. This could be because of the pressure as you are putting the paintbrush down on the paper, but whilst it's still wet, simply load back up on your paintbrush and add more paint to the area that you've just painted. This will create a more solid colour throughout the whole area. Alternatively, if you decided to do a different technique where you wanted a bit of relief between light and dark, you can do the same thing, but just keep one area lighter than the other and fill up more paint on the area that you wanted darker. As it blends through, you can decide whether or not that's what you want, and again, I'll show you the lifting out technique with some tissue. So we've got this area over here and it's really, really wet. So I've got a chance to lift it out still. It's not dried on. I can just show you a bit of the paper towel relief. And again, with the yellow, the same thing. It is still wet, so I can dab, press quite hard to lift out some of the paint, and there we go. I'm also going to go in and lift out this entire green area that I have just painted. Obviously it is still really, really wet, so I'm going to get a clean area of the paper towel and just dab it out. Between every lift that I do with this paper, I am making sure that I have a clean area, because if I didn't have a clean area and I used this part, then there would be some black paint in on the green as well. And whilst we have dabbed most of this off, obviously the outside of this paint has had time to dry, so there is a slight outline to it. And that's what I meant by the crisp edge. It's a really, really cool effect, and it works well for things like the bee's wings. Whilst we're on the subject of the bee's wings, here is another little tip for you. So, rather than mixing an entire colour just for painting these little wings, I actually reuse the paint water. So the water, once you've been mixing it with a few things, starts to become like a muddy brown grey colour, and it is ideal for doing translucent wings. So this is a really soft, subtle colour that you can add to it without needing to mix something or blend any other colours. If it's against the bee on a black area, you can bleed some of the black paint from the bee into the wing, and it gives a really, really cool effect, bringing the entire painting together. Adding more water to it will allow the black to move around the wing more freely. Just remember, if you are really, really quick, you can clean up a mistake as long as you have a clean, wet paintbrush. You can lift the paint like we did with the black. I'll show you again. So I've got some black on the paper. Let's do a splodge. Come on, just like that. Really, really quick. Clean paintbrush, a wet one, lift it out, make it wet, dab it off, and it's gone. Bam! Like it was never there before. So that is some of the tips that we're going to use today in this painting. If you have any questions again, please leave a comment and I will answer them for you. The paint is still really wet on this page, so as I'm moving it around, the paint is moving with it. If you don't want your paint to move around, if you want it exactly where you've put it, then lay it flat on the table and allow it to dry. Alternatively, you can move the paint around and make new shapes and patterns with it as it dries. That is it for testing out the paint techniques today. Again, if you wanted to have a look at the wet on wet worksheet that I have put together, it is available to download in the link in the description below over on my Discord. I'm going to be moving my paint out of the way. I'm going to pour this into the dirty water paint pot and get myself a fresh, clean water. It is always good to start with clean water at the beginning of a painting. I'm going to move this to one side and I'm going to grab myself a new sheet of paper because in the next video we're going to sketch out our bees. Take your time, have some fun, and I'll see you over in the next video. Now I just need to decide which bee I want to paint today.